I'm committed to a sort of dogged hopefulness that there is some way that we can continue to kind of rise up each day and do something that we can feel like we're living with integrity. We may be complicit in, but we are using our position in a system to try to transform the system from within. And we can give ourselves a little grace with that and to try to be of service to this massive, monumental, emergent transformation that we're trying to facilitate. In a context where people are struggling with meaning and a lack of meaning, that to me seems like a very meaningful way of being in the world right now. And it's also a kind of call to be in service to something much, much bigger than ourselves for the sake of humanity in the future, which I don't know how much more meaningful a call can be than something like that.
Welcome to Voices of Emergence. I am Rudy, and Voices of Emergence is where inner transformation meets systemic regeneration. Today we are joined by Brendan Graham Dempsey, writer, theopoet, cultural philosopher, and one of the most articulate voices exploring the metamodern condition and what comes after postmodernity. With piercing clarity and mythic resonance, Brendan invites us into a renewed relationship with meaning, one that honors our spiritual longing while remaining grounded in cultural critique, symbolic literacy, and evolutionary insight. His work navigates the mythic edge of collapse and creativity, offering not just critique but symbolic coherence for a generation searching for ground between worlds. And together we'll explore, how do we hold the sacred in an age of irony and fragmentation? What does it mean to metapoetically engage with culture, collapse, and change? And how might the metamodern sensibility help us reimagine leadership, spirituality, and shared meaning in times of profound uncertainty?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I appreciate that kind introduction.
Yeah, good to have you here. So, first question, when you hear the word emergence, what does it evoke for you, philosophically or personally?
Yeah, emergence is a pretty potent idea for me at many levels. Conceptually, philosophically, it evokes a notion of a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. It evokes synergy, things coming together to unlock new levels of potential that weren't possible without more complex configurations. Also, a sense of spontaneity, uncertainty, unpredictability. You can't really predict what's going to emerge. It just emerges. When it does, there's this new level of capacity, power, insight, depth, and all of those can then be leveraged for the kind of profound, more complex problems that we face. So it's a very potent idea. For me, on top of that, though, I see a lot of spiritual significance in the notion of emergence as well. I actually wrote a book called Emergentism, which tries to present a way of thinking religiously or spiritually about this concept and situating ourselves in our kind of big history, evolutionary, cosmic story through the lens of emergent levels of complexification. So for me, emergence is also a kind of orientation towards existence that sees this bigger story at play in a way that can connect us all the way back to the origins of the universe and situate us as part of a kind of cosmic story of emergence and new levels of complexity. There's a symbol I use in that book. Only the visual YouTube audience will be able to see this, but I have a kind of tattoo of this symbol of this kind of emerging eye out of the unconscious or the non-conscious, and understanding cosmic history in terms of this deepening of consciousness and this deepening of awareness through emergent processes is something that is a kind of almost sacred narrative for me as well. So anyway, that's just some initial things that evokes.
That's fascinating. What led you to this point? What called you to do the work you're doing, which I perceive is at the intersection of spirituality, philosophy, cultural evolution, and how does meta-modernity fit into it?
Yeah, well, so I've given some version of my story in different contexts here and there, but the SparkNotes version is that I had something of a big meaning crisis in my early 20s, existential crisis that was born out of a critical engagement with the meaning system I'd grown up in, which was a very conservative brand of evangelical Christianity, which I got really invested in and was on a career path to play out and try to contribute to that in the form of either a pastor or what was seeming more likely was like some kind of professor of Christian history and biblical studies. But as I got really into the critical study anthropologically of religion and historically and compositionally in terms of the Christian tradition, the Bible, and all these things, and kind of unpack that, there was a profound dissonance that introduced, because it jarred a lot with the way that this story, this frame, had allowed me to make meaning since my youth. And that really knocked me off my rocker, not being able to make sense of that. So I had this kind of meaning crisis, and that was a very vertiginous, confusing, disorienting place to be in, and had to then court other philosophies, worldviews that hadn't ever seemed viable to me before, in terms of materialism and reductionism, determinism, nihilism. And so I spent some years kind of working through all this, and eventually returned to a kind of different way of looking at what spirituality is, how it unfolds, what our role in it is, etc. And found, I guess, some kind of existential mooring again in a very different conception of all this. So that was very healing and very therapeutic. But it also kind of turned me on to the idea of worldviews as such, and the way that meaning systems work for us to kind of orient us to the world, and what it looks like, what it feels like, most of all, to like lose that sense of meaning and purpose and orientation. So that was really what got me on the track of thinking about meaning and meaning making. I was really, though, interested to track this not just at the individual level, which I experienced, but was also seeing a version of this as sort of a collective story that had played out in cultural history and in kind of the intellectual history of ideas. There's one way of reading at least a kind of Western narrative of this medieval Christendom that experiences this enlightenment, disenchantment, and on into the Industrial Revolution, and this disenchanted world that Max Weber talks about, a sense of collective confusion, collective disorientation, collective vertigo that Nietzsche very famously spoke to in the late 19th century with the death of God, and prophesying that we were going to collectively be having to deal with this, which I see very much as having come to fruition with the rise of postmodernism and the deconstruction of all these ideas that followed Nietzsche's pronouncements. So I saw this really interesting parallel. I felt like I experienced a version of this individually, but I also read this as part of kind of cultural history. And I wanted to make sense of it. So that got me looking into ideas around what is modernity and modernism, what is postmodernism, what was the pre-modern and the traditional. So I started studying that a lot. And that's what led me then to, the question of, well, if postmodernism was the last thing that people were talking about, and at this point, that was already rather old, then are people talking about what comes after that? I was also very dissatisfied with kind of the postmodern milieu and the art that was on offer and the kind of worldview that it was suggesting, because I didn't feel like it was, one, a place you could sort of meaningfully live from, and two, just aesthetically, I thought that it was this deconstructive, fragmented, kind of wallowing almost in a kind of ugliness and a loss of things. And even just from a kind of artistic level, that didn't sit right with me. It didn't sit right with my sensibility. So I was really interested in like, all right, well, are people talking about something on the other side of this? And that's how I discovered metamodernism back in 2013, 2014. And at this point, this was really a very early nascent kind of field of study, people theorizing about these new trends in culture, a return to myth, a return to kind of grand narrative thinking, but in light of sort of postmodern critique and irony. And all these things really resonated with me very profoundly. They connected a lot with my own sensibility, with the artistic work that I was doing. And so I felt like I'd found a kind of ideological home in this sort of meta-modern space. And since then, just so many other things have then flowered out of that kind of moniker. And basically the 10 years that's followed that, you had the Hansi Freinacht works show up talking about metamodernism from a kind of integral perspective with complexity and kind of cultural evolution as a theme. You had Jason Storm show up with his philosophy and new way of talking about a paradigm of theory. So there's been a real kind of flowering, or one could even say emergence, that's occurred in this meta-modern space that has really even deepened my kind of appreciation for this way of seeing things, and it has really filled out a lot of the details of what this is about. So for me, that's kind of completed this sort of arc of sort of coming out of a traditional religious background, having a meaning crisis very akin to the sort of like Enlightenment era rationalizing, like collective loss of faith, on into a kind of postmodern deconstructive nihilistic, wrestling, and then having a kind of sense of resolution by moving through that, reconstructing something in a meta-modern register that's able to kind of make sense of that arc by appreciating this as sort of a developmental cycle that plays out not surprisingly, both individually and culturally and collectively. So that just kind of ticked so many boxes for me intellectually, spiritually, existentially, etc., that here I am.
Wonderful. In your work also and in your journey, I see also that, collapse is an important part, and also collapse without despair. But I think there's a big difference of what we imagined as the collapse like 1 year ago and what we are seeing now, like in the last 6 months, what is happening right us. Like this morning, for example, I don't read the newspaper every day, but I was just looking at the newspaper and I mean, like everything was just about collapse and things are, tumbling down. And, there's I couldn't find anything positive, in the newspaper. It was all about, these messages about collapse. What I like about your messages also is about collapse without despair. And I think everybody who has gone through like a spiritual journey knows that, there is some collapse and then you need to rise, from there. And how do you do that? But in the world that we are seeing now, how do you, how is it any different, like, the collapse without despair? How does that look personally and on a collective level? And how do you see that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there. I mean, what I would say, maybe just as a place to start, is a lot of my maybe talking about collapse without despair certainly works at a kind of individual level, in the sense that I, through my meaning crises that I just described, was later on able to understand those crises, those collapses of meaning, those collapses of a way of being in the world as a growth process. It was a learning process. And being able to get that vantage on my experience that way radically reframes the entire thing. Individually, through our lives, as we experience collapse or deconstruction, which is a big theme now currently in evangelical and Christian contexts, people wrestling with deconstructing their faith, etc. The notion that there is something that this is in service to, which is a broader flourishing on the other side of getting out of older, more rigid, more fragile systems and kind of growing into something bigger, something more comprehensive, more open, more viable, more conducive to human flourishing. So there's certainly an element in which that occurs, again, at the individual growth level. Now, whether or not we can understand what's happening collectively in a similar way is a big question. That's an invitation, I think, that is something we should take seriously, that not all collapses are apocalypses, let's say, in the sense that they lead to some radical end, but that they can be transformations towards something better. I guess more accurately, if we wanted to dig into what the idea of an apocalypse really is, we could actually work with that, which is that an apocalypse really means a revelation, an unveiling, a casting aside of the veil and seeing something new. Even in the religious tradition, apocalyptic thought wasn't just all doom and gloom. It actually was a sense of something new is being born, a new heaven and a new earth and this sort of thing. So however we interpret that, and there are different ways, certainly people interpret those kinds of ideas, even within the notion of collapse as apocalypse, there's something that we could take from that as a sort of hopeful orientation to this world, this system, this world system, this structure that we're inhabiting is in some ways clearly coming to a kind of close as we know it, and something new is being born. And so I think that it is an invitation we should rise to see that as a process of growth and transformation rather than just collapse. And I didn't make this up. I forget, it's sometimes spoken of by different folks in this kind of space, but people talk about the difference of breakdown and breakthrough, right? I think this is helpful for understanding our current moment as a potential reshuffling of our system in such a way that we can see it reorganizing to a new level of complexity. And that's what happens when systems basically reach their limits. This is a complex systems kind of framework that I'm using here, but I think there's one way of reading our current situation in these terms. When a system is no longer able to continue evolving and developing as such, it faces a chaotic breakdown, which then introduces new levels of degrees of freedom and uncertainty into the system. This is the occasion for either a breakdown of that system, which would be a kind of death of that system. It succumbs to that entropy and just loses the complexity that it had, or it can find a new structural way of reorganizing into a more complex system which would be a breakthrough to a new level of capacity, synergy, and emergence. That seems to be the crossroads that we're at, and we don't really know how to read this yet. What we're facing, what we're undergoing is clearly an infusion of chaos into the system. You look up the daily newspapers and there's collapse and chaos all over the place. Our institutions are breaking down. Our ecological system is facing severe degradation. Our sense-making capacities and our technological sphere. I mean, you could go on. And so that seems a lot like chaos and collapse. The question before us is, can we find the appropriate points of intervention into this moment that we're living in to help facilitate a more complex reorganization of a new structure that will be more complex, more synergistic, and more emergent? That's the story that we can lean into. I invite people to lean into that for many reasons, but that would be, I guess, just a first pass at thinking about collapse without despair. There's so many other angles to that issue, but that's just one. So I'll start there.
Yeah, whoever's done inner work might recognize that there's a point where the ego resists. Like we see the patterns clearly, we see the shadows clearly, and we're like, okay, well, now there's an opportunity to behave differently or to do something differently. But the ego only knows the past. The ego only knows what it's always been like, and it kind of like, fences in and says, no, we're not going to change. We're going to stay just the way we are because that's what feels safe to us. And it's really a big leap to emerge into a new version of ourselves. And it feels like collectively, this is what's happening. And so there's like a regression from postmodernism back into modernism rather than emerging into metamodernism or something else. It's kind of like going back or even going into hypermodernism, like technology is going to save us, AI is going to save us, right? So there's this phenomenon that seems to be going on. And so I wonder, are there shadows that we have yet to name? And importantly, are there any archetypes that can guide us forward? For me, an important signal for me is seeing a wolf. When I see a wolf, I'm like, oh, the psychopomp is here. The wolf is going to lead me into the dark forest and then will bring me back. It's kind of like Virgil taking Dante into the Inferno. And so I'm like, okay, the wolf is important. But what, are there any kinds of archetypes like Merlin or something that can show us something new?
The whole story of the hero's journey is the kind of big archetype that we're talking about here. Folks have done good work already to connect these different archetypal models to each other, whether that's the hero's journey or complex systems. But there is this classic trope of the hero sets out because there's a problem, there's a challenge, something's broken in the world, there's a need, there's a lack. And there are different kind of archetypal representations of that. Probably the one that we're most facing right now is something like the tyrannical father, which is something like a system that becomes rigid and ossified and refuses to change. And because of that, the kingdom begins to fail, right? You get to see, let's say, drought or famine or some kind of plague, right? The tyrannical ruler who's not allowing the new thing to emerge is leading to the degradation of the kingdom. And therefore, that summons the would-be hero to rise up to the challenge of that moment and accept the call of the journey. And in that, there is a going down, a catabasis into the underworld, into the shadow, into the chaotic, the unknown, where facing a number of trials, the hero then encounters that chaos, confronts it, and is able to sort of wrestle from that netherworld of the chaotic abyss something new that they can bring back up to the world of the everyday to transform, to heal, whether it's a kind of mythic kind of potion or some kind of cure for the plague or some kind of insight. They return and they're able to heal the degraded kingdom. And so that I feel like is kind of the story that we're currently in. If we wanted to use archetypal language here, we see the degradation of the kingdom. We see, in this sense, the king, which is the system that we're embedded in that is ossified, it's rigid, it's kind of unable to or unwilling to change. And that's not just the system, that is egoic patterns of behavior, right? It's people wanting to live a certain way and refusing to change. And so leading to all the kind of downstream consequences of a kind of rigidity in our behavior. And so, in a sense, this is the call for the breakthrough to descend into this chaos and try to wrestle out some new complexity. And I think that that is what this time in between worlds is sort of grappling with. We're wrestling with that. One of the things that's so hard about it is that we're talking about whole systems, right? And so it's not just an easy little potion or some magic leaf or whatever. It's a whole new way of being. It's a whole new way of self-governance. It's a whole new worldview. It's this and that somehow we need to instantiate in the world to heal it. And no hero, no one person can do this. We are collectively the hero, whoever will. It's sort of, this is our call to action. It's our call to accept the summons of the journey. People listening to this, watching this, people part of this community who get the profound suffering that we're experiencing in the current kingdom, I think that that is a call. And I mean, that's one archetypal model to be able to understand this. It at least places us in the context for understanding what we're facing, why the newspapers are reading what they are, this sort of thing, and gives us a sense of where we are in this process. So maybe that's a little bit of a map and some orientation for people to get a sense of what then the next step of the journey is. I'd have to think more about other kinds of archetypal symbols or images in terms of different mythological traditions. I'll sit with that a little bit and see if anything kind of emerges for me.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. You know, in a lot of groups that I'm part of, that we are part of, I think there's a huge awareness of like, things are never going to be the same again.
Mm.
And so that's deep awareness. And it also creates a type of hesitation to move forward because we are skipping an important step. And that step is grief. Because we never learn how to grieve deeply. You know, before we can open our hearts, we need to learn how to grieve, you know, before everything opens up again. So how do we hold grief of civilizational decline while still creating and contributing? How do you see that, you know, part of skipping the step or diving into the step, or really, why is it important?
It is really important. It's essential. Others have made this comparison, but you know, there are the stages of grief, right? One of the first is denial. Maybe that is the first, technically. We want to pretend like everything's still fine. A lot of our society is in that stage. There are also patterns of behavior that emerge in these different stages of grief. And I think people who just have been through the process kind of know what they are, in the sense that, for example, once you admit that there is something to be grieved, that there is this profound loss, there is this profound problem, and you can kind of work through the denial part, frantic concern to somehow attend to it. And there's maybe a getting lost in the grief, and that can look all sorts of different ways. Some folks will face it with a kind of frenetic energy to, oh my gosh, there's this huge problem, we've got to ... And they'll run around and they'll yell at people saying, you're doing the wrong thing. You're a terrible person because you're not washing out your plastic bags and you're doing all these things. And then there's a whole way of being that shows up in the people processing grief as a need for radical or urgent change. Definitely been there myself. Definitely strained a lot of relationships in that stage of the process. Somewhere either along that spectrum, maybe a little bit after that, or maybe sometimes just instead of that, people just immediately go to some kind of hopelessness of, oh my gosh, it's all hopeless. We're all screwed. This is, you know, and then they get subsumed in grief to a kind of paralysis. I mean, I think these are all actually important parts of this process. Point is that it is a process, and that if you get stuck in any one of these progressive stages, maybe that's what's unhelpful. But moving through this process is essential, because we don't want to be stuck in denial. Then we're never going to encounter the problem. We're never going to do anything about it. We're only going to be making it worse. That creates a lot of cognitive dissonance. It creates a lot of external problems as well, obviously. So that's not right. We want to do something about it, but at the same time, we're so impotent in the sense of our human capacity to change what is so massive of a system that's mostly useless, and sometimes worse than useless, because you wind up alienating people in your attempt to try to make things better. You wind up straining relationships. You wind up becoming judgmental. You wind up becoming a kind of unpleasant person to be around. And therefore, people aren't looking to you as some wise guide into the future. They're saying, oh my gosh, these crazy people, I don't want to have anything to do with that. I guess I'll just keep on doing exactly what I'm doing and celebrate it, because I don't want to be this, you know, absurd person over here. We don't want to be stuck in paralysis. It's a very understandable response to just sort of break down and give up in the face of this insurmountable problem, this meta crisis that we're standing before. But of course, that doesn't do anything either. That allows a kind of complicity in it to continue being destructive and degrading. And so to the degree that we really don't like what is occurring and don't want to support this, then we have to move out of just grief and paralysis into some kind of action. And so people talk about, I know Zach Stein uses this framing a lot, of the pre-tragic, the tragic, and the post-tragic. There's a movement here of these stages of grief, the pre-tragic being just not even aware of the problem, or aware of it, but trying to just shove it under the rug and be in denial. The tragic, confronting it, freaking out, or collapsing in paralysis and utter grief and utter inability to do anything. But there is a post-tragic place to be on the other side of this. And I think that's where we're called to try to enter into. And it is looking the problem square in the face, being honest about them, having allowed ourselves the grief, allowed ourselves to feel this profound sense of world suffering, and at many levels. But again, we can't just stay there. Recognizing all of that, we then see how on earth we can possibly be of service to some new thing emerging in our society that can do whatever is possible to find the next step, to find however we can the next piece of that new system, and see how we can potentially be of service in putting that into play, or finding groups of like-minded people who are also trying to do these kinds of things. And also then integrating the insights of how you've burned through your other options here, right? I think it's really important on the post-tragic side of things to recognize it's really not helpful to just go and berate people for their behaviors and yell at them and say that, they're destroying the world and all this kind of stuff. The post-tragic mindset allows you some conceptual understanding that in some ways that's not wrong, right? I mean, I know people, family, friends who there are behaviors that I know are actively making the world much, much worse. I also know that if I try to bring that into the basis of our relationship, that's just going to fray and fragment things even more. And so there's a way in which you are kind to people, you are compassionate about it. And this is also important to recognize your own complicity, right? Your own inability to escape this whole thing that you're grieving. I mean, that's one of the hardest steps, because it feels in some ways like you're a profound hypocrite to whatever degree that you recognize the systematic problem and yet are unable to do anything about it, and in fact are contributing to ways that is in some ways making it worse. But I think that there's a humility there, there's a compassionateness there, there's a charitability there, a graciousness, a magnanimity there that is able to enter a post-tragic understanding of the sheer scope and problem of our situation, but give people grace, give yourself grace, see whatever you can possibly do to be of service and make things better, and work from that position. So for me, that's kind of the arc of that. And yeah, again, having experienced some version of that myself, it's also helpful to get a sense of where different people are at in their own journey through that process, and to also recognize that there are things that you are not seeing that you're missing out on, and to be humble, I think, is one of the key things. So anyway, that's what comes up for me when you raise that question. I guess the last thing I will say, though, is that again, I'm committed to a sort of dogged hopefulness that there is some way that we can continue to kind of rise up each day and do something that we can feel like we're living with integrity. We may be complicit in, but we are using our position in a system to try to transform the system from within. And we can give ourselves a little grace with that, and to try to be of service to this massive, monumental, emergent transformation that we're trying to facilitate. In a context where people are struggling with meaning and a lack of meaning, that to me seems like a very meaningful way of being in the world right now. And it's also a kind of call to be in service to something much, much bigger than ourselves for the sake of humanity in the future, which I don't know how much more meaningful a call can be than something like that.
Yeah, there's something about metabolizing this grief as we go through change, somehow allowing it to flow through, feeling it. And for me, one thing has become important is morning routines. So kind of like to bring some kind of structure and discipline into the day is even just starting with the morning. I also participate in Lakota-style vision quests and Sundance rituals. These are annual, and these are stronger ways to catalyze some kind of change. And it even feels like a portal that I step through each time I do it. It's a new reality on the other side. And you've written about art and ritual as vessels for meaning. What do you feel is the role of the poet or artist or mystic today? And Do we need collective rites of passage? What might
Mm.
that look like?
Yeah. Well, this is really one of the most important things for me, and it informs all the work that I do and have been doing for the past 15 years, I guess, at this point. I see the role of the poet and the artist here as being those creators of the new. You know, that is the heroic rising to the call, accepting the call, and being willing to go down into the underworld of the unconscious and summon from there new symbols, new images, new frameworks, ideas that you can bring back up to the world to help heal the degraded kingdom. That is really what the kind of monomyth that Joseph Campbell's talking about, I think, is really, that's what he's getting at. That in some ways, all the myths have been telling us a story about myth making and the role that myth itself plays in healing, in up-leveling, in allowing for breakthrough and transcendence. And so for me, as someone who experienced the breakdown of my own mythic meaning system and the need to then make a catabasis, go into the underworld, I figuratively did it through art. I wrote a 500-page epic poem in which the speaker of the poem goes down into the underworld in search of God, in search of some way to revive and resuscitate what had been lost with the death of God, and then having to work through that, come back up to the overworld and offer into this famine, this meaning suffering, what would you say, this meaning starved world, a new sense of the sacred and the divine, which leads the speaker to find all these other artists who are also engaged in this task, who are creating sculptures and symphonies and art. And they then go back into the city that's been overrun by the salesman and the beast, which have turned the world into this commodified, asphalt-covered, nature-starved, postmodern hellscape, and explode into this new imagining of the divine, these new symbols, this new mythic way of relating to these deep truths. So that to me is that's the whole goal, aspiration, inspiration for artists willing to accept that call, is the fusion, I guess you could say, of artistic and religious inspiration as we've traditionally conceived them. You know, Homer, as an epic poet, summoned the muse as an inspiring force to allow him to breathe forth, you know, insight and his mythic ideas. Today, we speak of artists as being inspired or getting inspiration. The prophets, also, even from the Hebrew tradition, there's inspired prophetic literature. There's all these ways in which there's this vocation that we, I think, are invited to, or those who feel called to do this, to tap into that inspiration and to try to be a channel for new symbols, archetypes, and images to come into the world. I wrote a book called Building the Cathedral, because I think this is what this task is all about, is that we are part of a multi-generational, ongoing human endeavor to manifest and give expression to the sacred in an evolutionary way. And that this is something that we showed up to ongoing in our lives. We will pass away and hand this off to the next generation, just as the builders of the great cathedrals were engaged in their temple building sacred construction. And so I look at the big task before us, I call it the great endeavor in my work, is to rise to the call of that and help give expression, help channel something that needs to come through that can speak to the reality of the sacred and the divine and the numinous as it exists today for our time and in the urgent needs of our time. So that to me is sort of the prophetic, artistic, inspirational call. Well, yeah, that's a lot. Something else, just pause there.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit on the importance of communities also and the relation to technology. So I think technology has also amplified the huge shift that we are on and the rising in consciousness and awareness for a lot of people. And at the same time, the algorithms are also basically keeping people in a certain frame or box system and they can't get out of it. And so how do you see like communities evolve? What kind of communities are basically thriving now? What are the tools that they are using? Because I feel we're also at a level now, or we're in a period where the tools that we are using, like WhatsApp and LinkedIn groups and Facebook and whatever, has been created like 20 years ago or has been envisioned 20 years ago. They've been created. but now they are not serving the cause any longer. So do you see any new tools also that are being created, or do you know about communities that are actually organizing with technology and moving that new space with different values and different skill sets perhaps?
Yeah. So even just in the last 5 years, I've actually started to see a real negative transformation in the technological tools that we've had to use for this. For at least, yeah, around 5 years, I've moderated and curated a couple of Facebook groups where each of them now has around 2,000 people in them. These have been really meaningful places for me to kind of find my tribe, have deep conversations about these ideas, and ultimately serve as kind of beacons or summoning spots where we're able to find each other so that then we can plan in-person events. And this has been a really magical way to use this tool, as sort of you've got this kind of antenna to the whole world that kind of acts as this funnel for people to be able to find themselves in online spaces, and then to use that as an organizing planning mechanism for getting together in real life. I run a retreat center in Vermont on 115 acres. It's called Sky Meadow. And we put on 2 metamodern spirituality labs every year. I started an institute here to actually have more of those kinds of events and more things coming from the integral community and Game B and just the liminal web in general. And so about half of the things, the programming that we do here in person, comes from this online community that I've been a part of now for half of a decade. And that's worked really, really well. It's been really wonderful. The online thing is its own thing, but then when you are able to get together, obviously some entirely new things can emerge. Now, over the past 2 years, the entire online platforms that have been in service to this kind of relational funnel have gotten worse and worse. The term for this is enshittification, which is things growing shittier and shittier because the perverse incentives of the profit motive have caused these platforms to degrade the entire quality of the user interface by throwing more ads at you, by throwing worthless content at you, by putting up reels that are just attention bait. And, I could go on and on. I think we're pretty familiar with the problems, but what's sad to me is that at this point, I'm really at my wit's end with these platforms. And I don't really think that anymore. I've stopped really engaging much on Facebook, and I'm now looking to migrate what is a very rich community still to another place, because any more staying in that space is just going to erode the soul of the entire thing. And it's also going to be continuing to be more and more complicit in more and more of what I think we're all trying to fight. So I am seeing a lot of people also feel that. I'm seeing people casting around for how can we migrate to spaces where this isn't such a problem. I'm playing around with some kind of paid services like Mighty Networks to try to bring people into a space there where we can avoid some of the worst of these dynamics and still have the online community. There are many problems just logistical with these alternatives, though, that has to do with classic problems that we face in terms of economies of scale and attention nexus and this sort of thing. I am not very hopeful that that will be a successful alternative. And I think for the time being, I feel very stuck in what is on offer. Now, to the other part of your question, though, yes, there are people working on alternatives. I'm actually an advisor for a group of folks who, under the moniker World Wise Web, who are working on alternative technologies based on blockchain and holochain and developing new ways of thinking about the internet. I'm hopeful that something like that could happen. We've seen moments in the past where people got really excited about like Web3 and that never really materialized. I think there are still champions of these kinds of things happening, but I'm sort of the person just waiting to see someone actually do it. And there have been alternatives produced, like Hilo is another social media platform that was well made and made with good intentions. There are other various folks kind of working on these kinds of problems. Unfortunately, it's just one of these systemic issues that the system now is ossified and it owns those dynamics. And it's hard to imagine sort of reproducing that in some new way that's better in an organic kind of evolutionary way and not just some kind of radical new transformative revolutionary move that just kind of skyrockets us out of the whole thing. So I don't know the answer, but we're seeing it everywhere and it infuriates me. It just grates on my soul. Everyone's excited. Oh, these new televisions, stream on demand and it'll be cheaper and we'll get to watch whatever we want. We won't always be berated with ads and this sort of a thing. And it was maybe kind of like that for a little bit, but then of course you get all the new streaming services that you have to pay for now. And then even when you pay for them, they give you ads. And then the screen, just to kind of, that goes to a kind of holding wallpaper screensaver mode, will give you ads in the images that it's showing, to you. So it's unavoidable, it's unescapable. And we need some kind of escape velocity out of this really, really ridiculously broken system that, I don't know what that looks like. So anyway, but this kind of stuff drives me absolutely bonkers. I think we can just try to do the best we can with what we've got. And I look forward to seeing people really actually create alternatives. And I'm very open to what those could potentially be.
Many of the stories, the internal storytelling that at least I have been brought up with, but also the archetypes are individual, like the primacy of the individualism, and especially in the United States is maybe the country which most prioritizes this. But Thich Nhat Hanh said, look, the next Buddha will probably be a Sangha. It will probably be a collective. And I don't know if that's a metamodern value. I think it's a higher level spiral dynamics or integral value is the collective or collective type of thinking. And what I find online now is that trust is an issue. People are anonymous, so you don't actually really know who's behind the words. The surveillance state is there. And so it's hard to build virtual communities with these kinds of issues. And also, from a spiral dynamics level, if we buy into that, people seem to be talking past each other. Some people are at the red-blue level still, and others are at green, yellow, turquoise, talking past each other. And you can see it happening in the community conversations where people really can't meet each other. And so there are these issues. So I don't know that I have a question around this, but it does seem like game B and liminal values are around the community and collective. And I myself participate in collective journaling. Instead of individual journaling, I do collective journaling at the Stoa, for example.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. I mean, I think there are different ways of having collective containers, and we should value all the different ways that can look. I don't think there's one way to engage in collective relationship. Even in online spaces, I think there are many different options of different scopes and scales, different kinds of membranes. This has been a real challenge for me as a moderator, curator of Facebook groups and having to take on the admin role, because you get a lot of flack from people who have issues with maybe how you want to maintain a membrane. My thought is that this kind of talking past each other bit is really important, because we can have very, very wide containers that basically you're not taking into account. And there can be a really important use for that. It's just a really open container where anyone can come in, anyone can share. That's really valuable. There are other containers in which you actually want to have a designated focus on the topics and issues of concern that, let's just say like yellow is interested in, right? Like that's meaningful for there to be a particular group that can kind of speak to these issues from that level of complexity, and to try to avoid a lot of what then becomes talking past and noise and confusion and misunderstanding. And so maintaining membranes like that is also valuable. And this can be really difficult in communities that are self-aware of these different levels, because some people will see that and they'll say, well, wait a second, isn't yellow, isn't teal, isn't this about a multi-perspectival approach? And then doesn't that mean this should be a totally open container in which all the levels? It's like, well, no, we can appreciate there are different membranes, different containers that are doing different things for different spaces, and that, all of those can be of service and of use. And I've seen a lot of friction that the online dynamics can create around that. And I think if people understood why some of those moves are made and what the purposes are, and if groups are very upfront and explicit about what that is, I think that could be a little bit better. But it is a source of a lot of talking past each other. And I think there are better and worse ways that people can navigate. I've certainly learned a lot in terms of what works and what doesn't to try to work with our limitations in online spaces. But I do think that there's a suite of different options that will suit different contexts better or worse. And I think if people are aware of that, then that can be really helpful. Onto your other point, though, around collective archetypes, I find that really interesting. And the most probably significant symbol that I mythopoetically have engaged is what I call the kaleidoscopic eye. That is a symbol that actually, if anyone's ever seen Alex Gray's painting, he has a painting called Collective Vision. And what it is a kaleidoscope of eyes that are all sort of converging towards a kind of bright central point. And this is actually, it's a very significant symbol for me. I kind of coined the term kaleidoscopic eye, but it's clearly an archetype that's in the collective unconscious and consciousness as well, because a lot of people use this symbol. And for me, it is significant for the reasons that you're talking about, that there's a kind of unity in that plurality, that there's a kind of singular I born out of or constituted by all these other I's and all these other perspectives. I just mentioned that because I do think that we need to start, again, mythopoetically speaking to, manifesting, artistically crafting new symbols that can help articulate this new way of being in the world that would be of value. And so that to me is just one potent one, but it's also an invitation for others to try to explore this mythopoetic space of saying, hey, how can we articulate this collective idea of the new Buddha being a Sangha in language that is vibrant, that speaks to today, that feels like it's capturing something that maybe is new and hasn't really fully ever needed to be captured before. And now, hence the need for artists and poets and others to give expression to this. So I think we need more of that, I guess, is the takeaway there, and hope to see more of that come online.
And just a follow-up comment on that, it's so interesting because the Eye of Sauron, that single one, all Palantir is called one single all-knowing and all-looking eye, compared to Alex Gray's collective vision. That's an interesting contrast.
Totally. So yeah, that's a great connection, because actually we could start getting into this archetypal symbolic conversation, but I know we probably don't have time for that. But there's a really interesting way in which what I just described has an inverse, and you've just kind of named it. But there's also a way in which the kaleidoscopic eye is related to another more traditional symbol called the Empyrean, which is, you mentioned Dante earlier, but Dante rises up into heaven, he sees the Empyrean, and it's basically, this sort of eye-like kaleidoscope that, has all these faces looking into it. It's the collective vision of Alex Gray, essentially, but in sort of medieval Christianity. What's interesting about that, though, is that there's an inverse of that, for example, if people have ever seen Everything Everywhere All at Once, the everything bagel is what I call the dark Empyrean. It's the inverse. It's the symbol of nihilism and negation and void. And it's very intentionally modeled on that kind of imperial like wholeness, but it's the negation of it. So anyway, yes, what you just described too about Sauron is really interesting because it's a similar kind of negated kaleidoscopic vision in that sense. So that's really cool.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. We touched already on so many subjects, and I also, you wrote about a lot of these subjects already in detail. And I wonder, what is your next project? What are you working on? Like, what's worth writing a book for now? Do you have already an idea of that? I think your last book.
Oh, yeah.
1.5 years or 2 years ago.
Yeah, so I started this project, which will probably be something of a magnum opus, called The Evolution of Meaning. I published the first volume of that. It's called A Universal Learning Process. This is volume 1. And I just finished volume 2, which is called Psyche and Symbolic Learning. So this is the proof copy here. Quite a bit thicker, actually, this one. And I'm now just starting volume 3, which is called Society and Symbolic Learning. The whole scope of the Evolution of Meaning project is sort of like it'll probably be like a 10 or 12 volume series or set, which is really actually, in my mind, it's one big book, but it's, I'm writing it serially, I'm publishing it serially. And it's also probably going to get to the point where it'll be too big to be bound in as one book. So anyway, so it's a series for now. But I'm really thinking about it as sort of like this one work. And what I'm trying to do with it is really tell this story of cosmic complexification and try to give that its full due, its full rigor academically, research-wise. I mean, this is 150 pages, and I think like 70 of them are just notes. Similarly, for the second volume, it's only like 220 pages, but then the rest of the 325 pages is notes. So I'm really trying to like give this integrative vision, this integrative worldview, like its most robust expression to date, I guess. The whole universal learning process and cosmic complexification leading to different emergent levels of matter, life, mind, and culture. And then the second volume basically starts zooming into the culture plane to look at the individual level of learning and development. So I get unpack a lot of the sort of developmental psychological models. The next volume is going to look at learning across human societies. And a lot of this is also a way to publish new research and data that I've collected on applying hierarchical complexity analysis to these developmental models and to historical texts. So then the next 6 volumes after that, once I've laid the foundations of this basic idea that human culture is a kind of cultural evolutionary learning process that leads to increasingly complex meaning structures, each volume will focus on each of these meaning structures. So you mentioned spiral dynamics. It's basically those structures, right? But now, instead of people just saying, this structure is a tribal structure and it deals with animism, and maybe it's like a couple of paragraphs that describes it, Well, what if you had like 200 pages to like dig into the anthropological literature and give examples and like quotes and actually score texts that have been conducted, through interviews with people in these contexts, and so really to kind of fill all that out, attend to various criticisms, give each meaning system its due, see how it transforms one into the next, use all this historical evidence, and then wrap all that up with some kind of big, philosophical, theological, kind of conclusions around what do we make of the fact that this story presents itself to us, and what does it all mean, and how do we interpret it? So that's what this whole big project is that I'm working on at present, and that has most of my time and energy, and it's been very rewarding. So anyway, I could speak more to that, but that's kind of the quick version of that.
That sounds like an incredible project.
Thanks.
Reminds me of Carl Jung's The Black Books. He's got like 7 black books, and then he's got the red book.
Yeah.
So something along those lines.
Well, actually, exactly along those lines. This would be the black books, but then I'm also planning a red book version of this, if it were, as it were. In fact, people can probably still find this online. I think it's on my website. I started writing a work called Omega, which is an epic poem, illuminated manuscript version in which a seraph named Dante appears to this person meditating and having a psychedelic experience, and takes them through a tour of the universe. And, as in Dante, who goes through all the levels of existence, this is going to go through all the levels of matter, life, mind, and culture, then go into the different levels of meaning systems and all this stuff. And it will kind of be a contemporary metamodern divine comedy or something.
That's amazing. What would you say to someone who's standing at the edge of transformation, unsure of how to proceed? Kind of someone who's sensing into what's happening and wondering what the future holds?
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of ways that people can be standing before transformation. It depends on what that transformation is. If it's an individual transformation, if they're standing before a collective transformation. But if I read you in terms of talking about standing before this present moment, and this kind of standing before a breakdown or breakthrough and all of that, and the situation that we're facing, I guess what I'd say is, 1, don't lose hope, take courage, and be curious. As someone who's writing a whole series on this whole cosmic story as a learning process, I feel that learning is absolutely key. The reason why the tyrannical father is such a destructive force is because he's refused to change. He's refused to learn. The whole dynamics that you were describing too, Alex, around ego, rigidity, and that resistance that people face, there's a pattern of behaviors that is causing maladaptation, that is not leading to our flourishing and viability and our collective flourishing. And yet people are doggedly determined to still keep assimilating all of that new feedback into their old system and not accommodate to some new understanding of reality. And that's where that tension, that's where that, that's what that is. But that assimilation, that accommodation, those are the dynamics of learning, as the Piagetians and the cognitive developmental literature tells us and shows us. And this is an evolutionary process. And so the biggest thing that anyone can do, because it can happen at any level, is just be open, be a little bit more open, be a little bit more able to accommodate to something, and not feel like they've got to assimilate what they think that they're seeing to what they think they already know. Like the biggest enemy of truths isn't lies, right? It's illusions. It's things that we think we know, but we actually don't. And so that is really the biggest challenge before us. And if people can just allow themselves a little bit of epistemic humility, a little more curiosity, a little bit of a pause before immediately jumping to conclusions or judging something, but just being receptive, being open, being like, that's really weird. That doesn't fit my model at all, but let me sit with that. Let me just kind of, take that in and let that stew. That's the biggest thing, I think, for all of us. And if we can all become collectively better at that, I think we'll also be just better, nicer, kinder, more compassionate, magnanimous people. A lot of the interpersonal strife that we experience also will kind of help be healed by that level of just openness. But it's the thing to do if we're going to break through and up-level our thinking about things at any stage, is allow in that new information that doesn't seem to fit, and rather than force fit it, find a more expansive frame in which we can actually find a comfortable fit by reorganizing our way of seeing the world. And then, you have insight, and you have awe, and you have wonder, and you open. And that's kind of the thing for us.
Beautiful. Thank you, Brendan, for your time and your amazing work. I wish you the best also in your continuation. So as a last question, if you have one seed to plant for the world, what would it be?
Gosh, that's a tough one. For the whole world, huh? One seed? I guess if it's just one seed for the whole world, it's got to be something pretty, like perennial, primordial, and seemingly simple, but also simplex, which is love. I mentioned that kaleidoscopic eye symbol, and the center of that mandala is always this love. It's something that brings things together, it brings into a more complex unity the multiplicity of everything outside of it. And that's what it was for Dante. That's the love that moves the planets and the other stars. But it's also, it's the eros of Plato. It's the whole kind of growing connection and intertwined intimacy of the universe as it deepens in a self-awareness. And so wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, if you can be a bit more loving and try to build a few more bridges and open things up a bit instead of closing off, cutting off, then I guess that would be the seed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan.
Yeah.
No,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been just truly fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Brandon.